So I don't know if it's possible to preach this week without talking about the events of the last week and to, of course, bring up the election cycle and all those things. And I don't know how much that's been garnering attention in your lives, probably taking up quite a bit of bandwidth for almost every single one of us. It's interesting as we watch the last few nights with protests going on around the country, and I don't want to pass any judgment one way or another on any of those kinds of things beyond the fact that you talk about these things and it's nice because the sermon text just kind of throws this one up for me to hit out of the park then, I guess. Because people are acting like it's the end of the world. It seems that most of the world now is expecting the end is just around the corner. Even if they are not biblically literate, it seems like they're still reacting that way. In fact, if you Google Trump's election and end of the world or phrases like that, you're going to see the two paired very closely together already. It's really interesting. In fact, I saw one image when I Googled quickly that showed Trump with Satan horns on him. He's clearly the Antichrist, according to some. Now again, I don't know if you love Trump, if you hate Trump, if you're somewhere in between. It doesn't really matter to me. It's just interesting to see the language and the rhetoric that is going on right now. And it's interesting to think about this whole election cycle and how upset so many of us were, how happy so many people were, how in between so many of us were. And just to feel the tension that was going on in our world around these events. And to see how upset so many of us were just about the changes and the trends in our world and the political dialogue that was going on. And then to see the fear as well. The fear of what was to come. No matter what the outcome of the national election, it seemed like things were getting worse in our country. And it's not just around the election. There's so many signs that people are oftentimes pointing to and saying, oh, does this mean that the end is drawing closer? Wars and rumors of wars and famines and those kinds of things are constantly around us. And people are oftentimes very scared. Now, it's interesting to see how Jesus talks about the end times. And it's interesting to see that when he brings it up here in our gospel lessons today, he does it off a positive note. Listen to this. It starts out, so some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. They're actually looking at how beautiful the temple is. They're admiring things and saying, oh, look at this beautiful thing that is sitting there that's testimony to God. And then Jesus takes that opportunity to go negative. That's interesting, isn't it? All right, he's saying, no, I don't want you to be focused on the temple because look what is to come. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase this next rather long section, all right? As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Teacher, how do we know when this is going to happen? What are the signs? He said, watch that you don't be deceived, for many are going to come saying, I am he, and the time's come. Don't follow them, all right? Then he said, nation is going to rise against nation, and there's going to be earthquakes and famines and pestilences and fearful events. Before this, there's going to be persecution. And he talks about that persecution. You're going to be brought in front of synagogues and prisons and kings and governors. But don't worry about these times. Don't worry about what you're going to say. I'm going to give you the words. Even when you're betrayed, you're going to be betrayed by friends and brothers and even by parents. And people are going to hate you because of my name. And he said, here's what will really tell you. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee. Don't go to the city. Go away from the city. And it's going to be a horrible time for people who are pregnant or nursing women. And there's going to be a great destruction of Jerusalem. Many will be taken prisoners. Many will fall by the sword. And Jerusalem will be trampled on. Now, here Jesus is not talking about the very end of the world, right? He's talking about a time, a specific time that was going to happen not that long after his death, within the next generation. And it would all come to pass exactly as Jesus describes it. These things would happen. The Jews would rebel against their Roman rulers. And the Romans would come down hard on them. They would come into the city of Jerusalem and they would tear down the stones of the temple, this sign of their rebellion, and they would tear down the walls of Jerusalem. And there would be thousands that would die and that would be taken away as prisoners. It would indeed be one of the most fearful times in the history of the Jewish people. And so Jesus is predicting that. He's predicting this as a sign of what was to come for them soon and as a sign of even greater events to come in the history of the world. And so he actually moves in this passage from talking specifically about Jerusalem to things that will happen to the entire world. So the picture of Jerusalem will be a picture, then a little foretaste of the end times. He said there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity. At the roaring and the tossing of the sea, men will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Right here in other texts, when Jesus talks about the end times, he likes to talk about it like this orderly creation. Remember the first 7 days in Genesis, right? Especially the first 6. He's sitting there and dividing things and ordering things and putting things together, right? And it's all orderly and precise according to God's design. And when he talks about the end then, it's everything falling apart. The order is gone and chaos is returning. That's the theme. Well, these kinds of signs are constantly around us, right? There's signs of end times, of things getting worse. Had there ever been a period in time when there were not wars and rumors of wars? No. Always. And it seems like things fade a little bit and then they get worse, and fade a little bit and get worse, right? There's constantly these signs around us. There's never a time when people were not nervous about all the earthquakes shaking the earth. No, in fact, I'm pretty sure I saw my phone tell me there was an earthquake last night somewhere. I can't remember. Where was that? Anyone see it? New Zealand, thank you. I remember seeing it this morning on my phone, and I didn't even think to read it any more in depth because of the way that it would relate to the sermon until just this moment. But okay, earthquakes, constantly these signs of earthquakes. And there's always places that are in famine and in need. And those kinds of things are constantly around us. And are things getting worse then, is the question. Are things getting worse? Is it a sign that the very end, not just the end times, which are always in after Jesus dies and rises again, but the very end is here? And it's hard for us to know. Now, there's people who like to find and figure it out. Now, they can't really use wars and rumors of war or revolution and those kinds of things because those things are always around. So they're sitting there and they're always looking for these little insights. And it's interesting if you Google those kinds of things again to see what people are pointing to say, oh, yes, now I know the very end is here. So I've done that any number of times in the past, and I thought, okay, I'll just check it out again to see what people are pointing to because I haven't looked in a couple years. Well, apparently PayPal and Bitcoin and phones that can pay, you can pay with your phones now and those kinds of things, that someone is convinced is the sign that the end is very near because that's a change in the currency system, and he finds some random Bible verse to kind of attribute that to. And of course, then it makes them fearful that eventually 666 will be part of every single one of our pins and codes and everything like that. So people are sitting there and they're always looking for those things. Or they're trying to say, there have been large animal die-offs. And like I said, remember, creation coming undone is one of the signs that Jesus talks about as the end times. And there have been these massive animal die-offs lately that they point to. And in fact, I did just read a story the other day about a bunch of puffins that are dying somewhere in the world, okay? And so they're sitting there and they're picking up on things like that and they're saying, look, see, the end is nigh. Not just close, not just in 100 years or 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years. No, the end is about to happen because look, the puffins and Bitcoin and PayPal are the sign. All right? And what do they want to do? They want to scare us. And it's easy to be scared, even for people who aren't worried about some of the things like PayPal or puffins. When we look at our world and say, are things getting worse? Well, in some ways they are. The Bible talks about immorality being a sign of the end, and we certainly look at trends in our society and we see increasing trends towards immorality. I talk to seniors constantly, and they're always talking about how much worse one generation is than the next, and there's some truth to what they're saying. And what's interesting is that it's not always that they're just, people shaking their fists at the world. It's that they're scared for the next generation, for their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids. And I can sympathize with that. When they sit there and look at it and say, see, isn't that a sign of the end? When Jesus says, be careful, of your hearts will be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and anxieties of life. Signs of immorality like drunkenness or dissipation just means worries and anxieties and things that can distract us. And certainly our news is focused on worries and fears, right? That's what sells the news. So how shall we react? How should we react to all these signs, all these things that are going on, whether it's the very end or whether the end is 1,000 years away, who knows? But how do we react to these kinds of things that Jesus is talking about and these kinds of things that we see in our world? Because the world is breaking. Do we panic? Do we hunker down like the tornado drill that I was just talking about? Do we duck and cover as individuals, as churches? Do we just sit around and wait? Those are not the reactions Jesus talks about. Our first tendency is to be afraid and to let fear drive us. But one of the things that I can say, and that I will say over and over whenever I talk about the end times, is Jesus does not preach the end times to make you scared. He does not want fear to be reaction. Instead, he wants two different things to come out of your experience when you hear him talking about the end times. The first is he wants you to be watchful. He wants you to be prepared. Listen to the parable that he says, and I alluded to a different parable, a similar end times parable when I was doing the children's message. Here's the parable of the fig tree. So he says, look at the fig tree and all its leaves. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves, and you know summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you will know that the kingdom of God is near. Why does Jesus tell all these things to us? Not so that we're scared, but so that we're what? Prepared. So that we're prepared. So that when things in our world get worse, we're not shocked, we're not surprised, because who said it was going to happen? Jesus. Jesus said it's going to get worse. Just be ready. There are going to be wars, and the wars are going to get worse. And there are going to be famines. And the immorality is going to get worse, and people are going to persecute you. Don't be shocked. Don't be surprised that these things happen, because I told you it was going to happen. Just be prepared. And the second reason Jesus talks about the end and all these terrible things that are going to happen is because, and this is unique, not the reaction you'd be expecting, he wants you to be comforted. He actually wants you to be comforted. And why can we be comforted by all these kinds of things? Why? Because at that time, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things began to take place, stand up, lift your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. You can be comforted. Because when all this stuff is going on, it just means that Jesus is a little bit closer to coming. He's a little bit closer to coming and undoing all the undoing that's going on in the world and making things right, making things orderly, and doing his new creation again. And so he says, look, you can be comforted because I'm drawing near. And all this stuff are things that I have predicted. And so if I predicted it all, I'm in control of it all too, right? Jesus gives us this great example here of one of the signs of the end of time, which was the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of the temple. And he gets really concrete and specific, right? He doesn't just say, the Romans are going to come and attack us sometime. Anyone probably could have sat there and looked at what was going on in Jerusalem at that time and said, maybe someday the Romans are going to besiege it and attack us, all right? But Jesus says, no, it's not just going to be one of those assaults, one of those sieges, one of those attacks like in the past. This is going to be another one of those things where the walls are going to be pulled down in the temple. Not a stone will be left upon a stone. That would have shocked the people. After all the work and effort that had been put into that temple, and all the money that had gone into it, for those great stones to be pulled down like that would have shocked them. And yet, when it happens then, what can people say? Oh, that's right. Jesus said this was going to happen, right? When the walls went down and thousands were killed and marched off into slavery, that's a scary thing, but at the same time they could say, guess what? That's what Jesus said was going to happen. When all those persecutions happened earlier in their history between Jesus and between the fall, and then they were marched in front of synagogues, and they were marched in front of governors, and we have all those beautiful stories in Acts showing exactly the things that Jesus talked about in this text, right? Exactly the way he put it out. Instead of being scared, they could say, oh, guess what? That's what Jesus said was going to happen. So instead of their reaction being fear and shock and anger, they could say, okay, God's in control. He's in control of it all. We may not like what's going on. God may not even like exactly what's going on, but he is still in control over these things, and so we can say he's in control of all of world history. And whether you love or hate Donald Trump, guess who's really in control? God. And when we look at the terrorism around the world, it can scare us for a minute, but guess what? God's in control. And when there are wars and rumors of wars, guess who's in control? God is in control. And God says that not only am I in control, that during these moments, during this time, I don't leave you alone. You don't have to be scared, because not only am I in control, I give you what you need for this time until I come again. And what is that? Verses 32 and 33 say it very clearly. I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass away until all these things happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Jesus tells us clearly, the one thing that you need most is my word. That if you sit there and you dwell in my word and you listen to my word, you're going to see my control. You're going to see my role in your life. And you're going to find that supernatural comfort that the world cannot give. Everything could happen seemingly perfectly in the world and then change in a minute. But guess what? My word won't change. And if you sit there and you find comfort in it on a daily basis, the world can swirl around you. And you will always have that rock. You will always have that comfort. And then it will drive you to God in prayer. And he talks about that too. Be always on the watch and pray, that you may escape all that is about to happen, that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. When Jesus talks about prayer there, he uses the Greek word deomai, which is to entreat God earnestly, to call upon him. And it's almost always used when a person's in times of distress. Are we in times of distress? Yeah. Yeah, any day in the end times, which we're always in, is probably a time of distress. So Jesus says, when things are good, pray to me, yes. When things are bad, pray to me. Call upon me. Bring me into your life. When you're worried, bring me into your life. When the world doesn't seem in control, when you're not sure what's going on, call me into it. Ask me to be part of things. Last week, I guest preached at a church in Adam. And one of the elders just, got up near the end of the service and he said, hey, a lot of us are afraid of what is to come. We want to trust. And so in between services, we're going to gather together and we're just going to pray. We're going to pray to the King who is on the throne, and no matter what happens the rest of the week, he will still be on the throne. And I loved it. It was so neat to see all those folks. Everyone stayed from the worship gathering to sit there and pray. And just pray for our nation and say, hey, God, your will be done. Whatever happens, it will be under your will, and you will still be reigning on your throne. And we can invite that into our daily life too. Every single day, no matter what's going on, when disease strikes, when relationships are broken, pray. Deomai to God. Call him earnestly into your life. I mean, we've been going through some major life transitions in our house right now, and huge work transitions for me. And I've been working these, kind of crazy hours, at least for me. And some things are going really well, and then some things, oh my goodness, how do we bring these things together? And I told my staff that we were too busy not to start every single day in prayer. I said, I know you all have a ton of things to do. I know there's vendors coming in. I know there's workers coming in and things that need to get fixed and everything else. But we need to start every single day in prayer. And so we have been. Every single day coming together as a staff, talking about other things, and then going to God in prayer. Deomai. God gives us his word, and it drives us to him in prayer to trust. And so, things like this, when the Bible talks about the end times, it can be scary. And when we look around at our world, at all these different signs and these things, the ones that maybe make us laugh sometimes, but then the ones that truly make us fearful, that's one possible reaction. There's a gentleman that I mentor and I disciple a little bit, and he called me up last week and said, Dan, does this mean the rapture is coming? I said, well, what's your understanding of the rapture, Thomas? Let's talk about that a little bit. And we talked for a few minutes about it. And what I realized is that all this stuff was constantly making him think that Jesus was telling him about the end times to make him afraid. And I said, no. Jesus never talks about the end times to make you afraid. He talks about it to give you comfort so that you're prepared. So you see all these signs and you say, that's just what Jesus said was going to happen. And if he said it's going to happen, he's in control. And if he's in control, then I can trust. And the way I trust right now while I'm living in it is I go to him and I read his word. and then I fold my hands in prayer. And so that's what I leave us with today. As we live in these end times, don't be shocked, be prepared. Read your Bible a little bit more and go to God in prayer. Amen.